right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be reading pages 106 through 111, and we're going to be talking about life in New Netherland. If you would like to get a social studies book, you can to follow along, or you can just follow along with me. And so the first thing we're going to look at is just talking about what life was like in New Netherland. And so remember, New Netherland is the Dutch area that was taken over. So we're looking at the 1645 to 1665 timeline here. We're going to come upon a couple of different vocabulary terms. One is indentured servant, slave, slave trade, plantation, bowery, and apprentice. We'll start off with Peter Stuyvesant. This is how you pronounce his name. That's why it's next to it. Peter Stuyvesant arrived in New Netherland as its new director, or leader, in 1647. Upon his arrival, cannons were fired. People had gathered to see the man whom the Dutch West India Company had chosen to direct the troubled colony. Stuyvesant knew changes were needed if New Netherland was to grow and prosper. He vowed to rule the colony, as a father would rule his children. I threw rule in there because I wanted you to understand that that's what he's talking about. So it sounds to me like he's going to be pretty stern. A time of growth. The Dutch West India Company tried again to get more Europeans to move to New Netherland. It printed ads describing the colony's rich resources. These ads promised land to colonists who made the journey. The ads also promised freedom that many people in Europe did not have. Soon, hundreds of families arrived in New Netherland. Children were born there, too. In 1660, about 5,000 colonists lived there. By 1664, the colony had about 9,000 people. I'm going to go to the next page. Many of these settlers came from the Netherlands, but others came from Germany, France, England, Sweden, and Finland. So we have settlers from all over. Those who wanted to come to the colony but could not pay for the trip came as indentured servants. They agreed to work without pay for a set time for the person who paid for their trip. New Amsterdam quickly became the colony's largest town. The fort, built in the 1620s, remained at the southern tip of Manhattan. A windmill sat on a hill to the west of the fort. Running north from the fort was Broadway, a dirt road that followed an old Indian trail. By 1661, Broadway and all the city's other streets had been paved with cobblestones. So they were starting to make some money and make it their own. At the north end of Broadway, a protective wall extended east and west across the island. Present day, that means today, Wall Street in New York City follows the path of this wall. A small canal east of Broadway ran north through the town. The town hall and the director's house stood near the banks of the East River. Behind the house was a beautiful garden. The place where the director's house stood is called Whitehall today. So back here they're talking about Wall Street. A big wall ran down this area east to west across the island. And now it's Wall Street. That's where they have a lot of different businesses and where they trade stocks. So let's go to the biography of Peter Stuyvesant. He was alive from 1610 through 1672. Character trait is civic virtue, so he cared about the world and the culture. In 1647, the Dutch West India Company made Peter Stuyvesant leader of New Netherland. Stuyvesant had already led the company's colony in Curaçao in the Caribbean Sea. Soon after he arrived in New Netherland, Stuyvesant became known as a strict leader, which we talked about back here. Even though many colonists did not agree with his rules, he helped New Netherland grow and prosper. It means they made a lot of money. He set up the first paid police force in North America to help bring order to the colony. And if you look at the very bottom of the page, it says the windmill in New Amsterdam, shown here, and it's right at the very edge, in 1653 was located near the Hudson River. The windmill was similar to those that were common in the Netherlands. We're going to go ahead and turn the page. So this image is showing the first slave auction in New Amsterdam, and it was held in 1655. If you remember, slaves were brought to this new country, a new area, to help with the tobacco industry. New groups arrive. Some people also came to New Netherlands from Africa and from Dutch colonies in South America. In 1654, some Dutch colonists who were Jewish arrived from a Dutch colony in Brazil in South America. At first, Stuyvesant did not want people of other religions in New Netherland. He asked the Dutch West India Company to make them leave. Wow. The company said his demand was unfair and that Jews were free to live and worship in New Netherland. So it looks like he was kind of having some segregation. He wanted to keep people out. Most of the people who came from Africa to New Netherland were slaves. Slaves are people held against their will and forced to work without pay. The first enslaved Africans in New Netherland were brought in 1626 by the Dutch West India Company. They lived in a house built by the company. In 1655, a ship carrying 500 enslaved Africans arrived in New Netherland. In the years that followed, the slave trade, or the buying and selling of enslaved persons, increased. The slaves were sold to colonists who used them to do the work on farms, in shops, and in homes. Other slaves had to help build ships and work on loading docks. Not all Africans in New Netherland were slaves. The Dutch West India Company freed some slaves. Other slaves were able to buy their freedom, so they weren't all slaves. Former slaves were not completely free, however. Each year, they had to pay their employers in money or goods in order to remain free. Imagine that. Also, children of former slaves remained enslaved until their parents could buy their freedom. In 1660, Stuyvesant gave some land on Manhattan to about 40 former slaves. This land, which stretched from today's Chinatown to Greenwich Village, became New Netherland's first community of free Africans. And right here, you're going to see this image. It's a wooden box from New Amsterdam, and it has Dutch-style carvings. So let me zoom in on that just a little bit. Some different carvings. All right, let's come on over here to a farming colony. We're going to look at this New Amsterdam up above. Here's an image. I'm going to zoom in for you. So number one, we have Breed Way, later known as Broadway. It ran south to Bowling Green. Number two, a canal ran along the path of present-day Broad Street. And number three, right here, a wall 2,340 feet long had been built along where Wall Street now is to protect the town. So you see there's a bunch of grass on the other side. So they're protecting the town from whoever's out here, which is really the natives. All right, let's go to a farming colony. Unlike earlier colonists who often returned to Europe, New Netherland's new settlers planned to stay. While many moved to towns such as New Amsterdam and Fort Orange, most newcomers came to New Netherland to farm the land. As a result, farming replaced fur trading as the main source of money for the colony. Settlers started farms mostly in the Hudson River Valley, and on parts of Manhattan Island. In fact, the part of New York City that is now Harlem was once a farming region. On large farms called plantations, some settlers in New Netherland grew grains and vegetables. Some planted orchards with peach, pear, and apple trees. Many colonists wanted to work on plantations in New Netherland because they could earn twice as much as they could in Europe. Farms that had both livestock and crops were called boweries. Remember, this is our pronunciation of the word. Bowery is Dutch for farm. Stuyvesant owned a bowery on Manhattan. Today, that part of New York City is called the Bowery. Shocking. In New Netherland, farm animals such as cattle, pigs, and goats roamed freely. Often the animals destroyed people's fields and gardens. And then we have an image here of 17th century jugs from New Amsterdam. Let's go ahead and turn the page. So we just left off with saying that the animals ruined things. So Stuyvesant ordered that all farm animals be fenced in. On Manhattan, this rule caused a problem. Wood needed for building was hard to find, so some people stole fences and used the wood to build houses. Stuyvesant then passed laws making fence stealing illegal. People who broke the law faced punishment or even death just for stealing. That's pretty severe from what it is now. The Dutch way of life. Although many new groups of people lived in New Netherland, the colony seemed Dutch. Dutch was the official language. Colonists built their homes in the Dutch style with sloped roofs, narrow first stories, and wide second stories. Many front doors were divided in the Dutch style into upper and lower sections. This allowed a person in the house to talk with others outside by opening only the top half of the door. In front of the door was a stoop or uncovered porch with benches. Colonists filled their homes with Dutch-style furniture. Beds were usually hidden in the daytime by doors or curtains. Some were even built into the wall and opened like cupboards. The Dutch used blue and white tiles to decorate their homes. They also cooked Dutch foods such as waffles and donuts. Children went to school 6 days a week, all year round. So for those of you upset with 5 days, only 10 months, look what happened. After finishing school, boys often became apprentices. An apprentice worked for a skilled craftsperson for 3 years or more to learn a trade. Most girls learned how to cook, spin thread, weave cloth, and sew. They also made soap and candles. Let's go back to some of these images. This here says Dutch settlers in the 1600s had brightly colored pottery. And down here, it shows some really neat Dutch materials. Among the items that a Dutch family in New Netherland might have used in their home were large cupboards called casts. That's this one, left. Iron firebacks, center, and cradles, right, made of mahogany. All right, let's go back to this very last set of paragraphs. Dutch women made beautiful lace. They also wove a strong cloth called linsey woolsey, a combination of linen and wool. From Native Americans, they learned to dye their cloth bright colors by using plants and berries. In their free time, families in New Netherland raced sailboats and horses and enjoyed sledding, sleigh riding, and ice skating. The Dutch sport of kolven also was popular in the colony. The game of hockey that some people today play is very similar to kolven. So here we have a picture, and it says Dutch settlers brought the game of bowling to North America. Who would have thought? All right, so you guys had a sheet that you should be working on throughout the reading, and if you haven't been working on it, well, you might want to go get it and get started. Good luck.